Idi Amin, one of the most infamous dictators in African history, was born in the early 1920s in Uganda under mysterious circumstances. While the exact year of his birth remains unclear, some sources, including his own son Hussein, suggest it could have been as late as 1928. Most historians believe he was born around 1923 or 1924. The location of his birth is equally contested. While some claim he was born in Kampala, Uganda's capital, it is widely believed he hails from Koboko, a town in the northwest near the border with Sudan, an area predominantly inhabited by Muslim communities. Amin's family background was equally enigmatic. His father, Andreas Niabire, is often described as a member of the Kakwa people who converted from Roman Catholicism to Islam early in the 20th century and adopted the name Amin Dada. Other reports suggest his father might have been Nubian, with roots in Sudan, and that he was raised as a Muslim. Amin's mother, Asa Ate, is said to have been from either the Kakwa or Lugbara ethnic groups, though details about her lineage remain uncertain. Amin's early years were marked by hardship. His father abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise him alone. He attended an Islamic school in the early 1940s, at a time when the Second World War raged across Europe and North Africa. His childhood, defined by instability and limited resources, would go on to shape his ruthless and power-hungry character. As Uganda was under British colonial rule, it was a country fractured by ethnic, religious, and political divisions. Amin grew up amidst these tensions, which would later influence his rise to power and the brutal dictatorship he would lead, forever altering the course of Uganda's history. Amin's rise to power was as dramatic as it was ruthless. In the early 1940s, Uganda, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, was a colony under British control. During this period, the British Army, which had a significant presence in the region, began recruiting local Ugandans into the King's African Rifles, KAR, a colonial military unit. Amin joined the KR in 1946, marking the beginning of his military career. His athletic prowess and leadership qualities quickly stood out, earning him the respect of his superiors. By the 1950s, Amin had climbed the ranks, serving in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, where he gained further military experience and notoriety. However, despite his success in the military, Uganda was undergoing significant political change. As African nations began to demand independence, tensions escalated, and the political environment in Uganda became increasingly volatile. The 1960s saw the rise of Milton Obote, a leader from the Uganda People's Congress, UPC, who became Uganda's first prime minister after the country gained independence from Britain in 1962. Amin, who had aligned himself with Obote and supported his rise to power, would later betray him. In 1966, tensions between Obote and the Buganda kingdom reached a breaking point, and Obote suspended the constitution, effectively consolidating his power. Amin, who was at the time Uganda's military commander, saw an opportunity to seize power for himself. Despite his military loyalty to Obote, Amin harbored his own ambitions. He began to secretly build his power base, recruiting supporters from his own ethnic group, the Kakwa and Nubian Muslims, within the military. In January 1971, while Obote was away at a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, Amin executed a well-coordinated coup. He swiftly captured the capital, Kampala, and declared himself president, promising to restore order and unity to Uganda. Amin's takeover was remarkably swift, and initially, many saw him as a potential savior of Uganda, a strong man capable of uniting the fractured nation. However, it wouldn't be long before his brutal regime revealed itself in full force. In the aftermath of his coup, Amin swiftly consolidated power, transforming Uganda into a brutal military dictatorship. He initially presented himself as a benevolent leader, promising to restore peace and unity to a divided nation. However, this facade quickly unraveled as Amin's true nature began to emerge. His regime was marked by widespread repression, political purges, and atrocities committed by his security forces, particularly his feared secret police, the State Research Bureau. Amin's first major act as president was to launch a series of purges within the military and government, targeting those who had been loyal to Obote. Thousands of people were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile, and the political opposition was virtually eradicated. Amin also focused on consolidating his control over Uganda's ethnic groups, favoring Muslims, especially those from his own Kakwa and Nubian communities, while persecuting other groups, notably the Akoli and Langi, who had been allies of Obote. The international community initially welcomed Amin's coup, with both Britain and Israel offering support. He was even invited to London and Tel Aviv, where he met with political leaders and presented himself as a champion of African unity. However, his charm quickly faded as the world began to realize the true extent of his cruelty. Under Amin, Uganda's economy, once growing under Obote's leadership, spiraled into disaster. The expulsion of the Asian community in 1972, including thousands of successful Indian and Pakistani business owners, further destabilized the country's economy. Businesses were handed over to Amin's loyalists, many of whom lacked the expertise to manage them, resulting in widespread economic collapse. Amin's rule became increasingly erratic as he grew more paranoid. He began to claim that he was the King of Scotland, an absurd notion that played out in bizarre ways. He even offered to become the king of an independent Scotland, a proposal that only added to his image as a madman. His obsession with power, coupled with his erratic behavior, only deepened Uganda's misery. Despite his increasing instability, Amin maintained a tight grip on the military, and his reign of terror continued for nearly a decade. He used the military as a tool to suppress dissent and maintain control, launching brutal offensives against anyone who posed a threat to his rule. It was only when his military began to fracture and his foreign policies turned increasingly hostile that Amin's downfall became inevitable. As the years wore on, Amin's regime became increasingly unstable both domestically and internationally. His paranoia escalated, leading him to make dangerous and irrational decisions. In 1978, Uganda's military forces, already spread thin and weakened by years of mismanagement, were drawn into a war with neighboring Tanzania. The conflict, known as the Uganda-Tanzania War, was sparked by a dispute over the Kagera region, a border area that Amin sought to annex. Initially, the Ugandan forces made some early gains, capturing parts of northern Tanzania, but the situation soon turned against them. Tanzania, led by President Julius Nyerere, quickly mobilized its military forces and, crucially, was joined by thousands of Ugandan exiles, many of whom had fled Amin's regime. The combined Tanzanian-Ugandan exile forces proved to be too much for Amin's overstretched army. By early 1979, the Ugandan military was in full retreat, and Amin's support within Uganda began to crumble. His once loyal officers started defecting, and defections from the military and the government grew as it became clear that Amin's rule was in its final stages. Amin, who had once seemed invincible, became a desperate leader clinging to power. In the face of mounting opposition, both from within Uganda and from foreign forces, Amin refused to step down. As Tanzanian and exile forces advanced toward Kampala, the capital, Amin was increasingly isolated. On April 11, 1979, as the Tanzanian-Ugandan exile forces closed in on Entebbe, Amin fled Uganda by helicopter, escaping to Libya. He was granted temporary asylum by Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi before eventually settling in Saudi Arabia. His departure marked the end of one of the most brutal and destructive regimes in African history. Amin's 8-year rule left Uganda in ruins, with an estimated 300 Hul to 500 Hul people killed during his reign. The country's economy was shattered, political institutions had been dismantled, and countless lives had been destroyed by his violent purges. Despite the chaos and bloodshed of his reign, Amin remained defiant even in exile, continuing to assert that he had been a beloved leader in Uganda and that he had been unjustly overthrown. However, Amin's time in exile was marked by a sense of futility. He made occasional efforts to return to Uganda, including a failed attempt in 1989, but he would never regain power. Instead, he lived out his final years in relative obscurity in Saudi Arabia, where he indulged in sports and luxury, but faced continued isolation from the world. Idi Amin passed away in Saudi Arabia on August 16, 2003, from kidney failure. His death brought little closure to the Ugandans who had suffered under his tyranny. Though his reign ended in disgrace, the scars of his rule remain deeply embedded in Uganda's history. His legacy serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the depths of cruelty that can arise when a dictator is left to rule without restraint. The aftermath of Idi Amin's brutal rule left Uganda grappling with profound challenges. The scars of his regime lingered in the form of a shattered society, an economy in ruins, and a deeply fractured political landscape. In the years following Amin's departure, Uganda's path to recovery was slow and painful. The interim government that took control after his exile struggled to restore order. The country was left in a state of political disarray, with multiple factions vying for power. The Ugandan People's Congress, the party that had initially supported Amin's overthrow, failed to maintain stability, and in 1980, the country held its first elections since Amin's fall. However, the legitimacy of these elections was widely questioned, leading to widespread discontent and the resurgence of guerrilla warfare. The return of Milton Obote, who had been exiled after Amin's coup, to power in 1980 further fueled the unrest. Many Ugandans viewed his return as a betrayal, as Obote's own regime had been marked by repression and corruption. This, in turn, sparked the Ugandan Bush War, a brutal conflict between Obote's government and rebel forces led by Yoweri Museveni, who would later become Uganda's president. Museveni's National Resistance Movement, NRM, ultimately emerged victorious in 1986, with Museveni assuming the presidency. However, Uganda's journey toward true peace and stability remained fraught with challenges, as the war left deep divisions and lingering trauma within the population. Despite the eventual transition to a more stable government Under Museveni, the legacy of Amin's reign continued to haunt the nation. His regime had set a dangerous precedent for authoritarian rule, and the trauma inflicted by his regime continued to affect generations of Ugandans. The country's economy, which had been pillaged during Amin's time, faced years of recovery, with much of the industrial and agricultural sectors in shambles. In addition, Uganda's political landscape remained deeply divided, as various ethnic and religious groups still held grievances from the violence and repression of Amin's regime. On a broader scale, Amin's rise to power and the subsequent devastation caused by his rule underscored the challenges of post-colonial Africa. Uganda's experience was not unique. Many African nations faced similar struggles in the aftermath of independence, grappling with the legacies of colonialism, political instability, and the rise of authoritarian leaders. Amin's brutal rule was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, and the international community's early support for him, driven by geopolitical interests, was a cautionary tale of how foreign powers can sometimes exacerbate the suffering of nations under oppressive regimes. In the years since his death, Amin's legacy has remained a subject of controversy. To some, he is remembered as a dictator who wreaked havoc on Uganda and caused untold suffering. To others, particularly among certain segments of Uganda's population, Amin is seen in a more complex light, remembered for his early promises of unity and economic prosperity, which ultimately gave way to his megalomania and violent rule. Historians and scholars continue to debate the full extent of his impact on Uganda and Africa, but what remains undeniable is the deep scars he left on his country and the generations that followed. The long shadow of Amin's rule continued to shape Uganda for many years after his downfall, with the wounds of his brutal dictatorship still fresh in the collective memory of the Ugandan people. As the country moved into the 1980s, it was clear that recovering from the devastation caused by Amin's 8-year reign would take more than just political change. It would require deep social and economic rebuilding. The fall of Amin, followed by a period of political instability under Obote's second term, left Uganda struggling to establish any sense of continuity or unity. While Museveni's rise to power in 1986 and his subsequent leadership brought some degree of stability, the trauma of Amin's regime, along with the complex ethnic, political, and religious tensions that were exacerbated during his time in power, made it difficult to heal the divisions that had been so ruthlessly exploited by the dictator. Amin's regime had decimated Uganda's educated class, intellectuals, and political elites, many of whom were either exiled or executed. This loss of human capital slowed the country's progress. Moreover, the systematic destruction of Uganda's economy under Amin's rule, marked by the expulsion of the Asian business community and the collapse of the country's infrastructure, meant that the recovery process would be long and painful. Even after the restoration of a more stable government under Museveni, Uganda's economy remained fragile for decades, struggling with poverty, inflation, and a lack of basic services. Socially, Amin's legacy left Ugandans with deep scars that affected how they viewed authority and governance. Many still lived in fear of their government, having grown accustomed to an era where even speaking out against the regime could lead to torture or death. This culture of fear, along with the government's involvement in arbitrary killings and disappearances made the concept of democracy seem distant to many, even long after Amin's fall. Amin's reign also complicated Uganda's foreign relations. His support for Palestinian militant groups, his alignment with Libya's Gaddafi, and his eventual hostility toward the West had alienated many international partners. As Amin fled to Saudi Arabia in 1979, it was clear that his relationship with the West had broken down completely, but his brutal dictatorship had already left Uganda isolated from much of the global community. His connections with the Soviet Union and Gaddafi's Libya, on the other hand, further entrenched Uganda's position as a pariah state. Internationally, Uganda's recovery from the damage caused by Amin's regime was also slow, and the country had to work hard to regain its standing on the global stage. Relations with neighboring countries, particularly Tanzania, remained strained for years after the Uganda-Tanzania War. The long-lasting diplomatic and economic effects of Amin's foreign policy misadventures were not easily overcome. Despite all this, Uganda did slowly begin to rebuild. Museveni's government focused on stabilizing the country, attracting foreign aid, and implementing economic reforms. The government worked hard to restore public confidence, reinvest in agriculture and infrastructure, and improve literacy and education. However, the specter of Amin's regime still haunted many, particularly the victims and their families, who lived with the memories of his reign of terror. In the years since Amin's death in 2003, Uganda has gradually moved forward, but it remains deeply scarred by the past. His actions left the country with an enduring legacy of fear, division, and distrust in political leadership. His name is still synonymous with terror, oppression, and brutality. For those who lived through his reign, the trauma remains, and for the younger generations, the lessons of his rise and fall serve as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. Amin's life and legacy serve as a stark reminder of the destructive potential of dictatorial rule and the importance of democratic governance and human rights in preventing such atrocities from occurring again. The painful history of Uganda under Amin underscores the need for vigilance in preserving political freedoms, ensuring accountability, and fostering a society where power is not concentrated in the hands of a single individual, but shared by the people. As Uganda continues to develop, the lessons of its past will hopefully guide it toward a more inclusive and prosperous future. As Uganda entered the 1990s and beyond, the shadow of Idi Amin's regime continued to loom large, influencing the country's political and social landscape in ways that were both profound and enduring. While Uganda made strides in rebuilding its economy and political institutions, under President Yoweri Museveni, the effects of Amin's brutal dictatorship left scars that would take generations to heal. During the early years of Museveni's rule, the country focused on stabilizing the economy, which had been left in tatters by Amin's disastrous economic policies. The destruction of the industrial and agricultural sectors, combined with a loss of skilled labor due to Amin's purges, meant that Uganda had to start from scratch in many areas. Efforts to improve infrastructure, promote literacy, and rebuild Uganda's damaged reputation in the international community were crucial to the country's recovery. Museveni's government pursued market-oriented reforms, attracted foreign investment, and worked on improving relations with its neighbors and the global community. However, the deep societal divisions caused by Amin's divisive policies continued to affect Uganda. Amin had used ethnicity and religion as tools of division, favoring certain groups while persecuting others, and this legacy of division remained entrenched. The country's ethnic groups were often seen as fragmented, with tensions simmering beneath the surface. Museveni's government, while more inclusive than Amin's, had to work hard to overcome the lingering mistrust and suspicion between various communities. One of the most painful aspects of Uganda's post-Amin era was the trauma endured by the survivors of his regime. Thousands of Ugandans lost family members or endured torture, exile, or displacement during Amin's rule. Many of the survivors struggled with the psychological scars of Amin's brutality, and their stories were often suppressed or ignored in the years that followed his fall from power. In the 1980s and 1990s, a growing awareness of the importance of truth and reconciliation led to efforts to bring attention to the atrocities committed during Amin's regime. However, there were many challenges in achieving justice and reconciliation, as some individuals in positions of power had been complicit in Amin's rule, and others feared the consequences of confronting the past. Despite the country's progress, Uganda's political landscape remained fragile. Museveni, who had come to power through a popular uprising, eventually began to face criticism for his long tenure in office and his increasingly autocratic tendencies. Over the years, he consolidated power and altered the constitution to allow himself to remain in office. While he made significant contributions to Uganda's economic growth and development, his government became more resistant to opposition voices, leading some critics to compare his rule to that of Amin in terms of the control and suppression of dissent. For the people of Uganda, the legacy of Amin remains a powerful force. His name is often invoked in discussions of dictatorship, political violence, and the dangers of absolute power. While Uganda has made significant strides since his regime, the lessons of Amin's rule, particularly the dangers of unchecked political power, the importance of inclusive governance, and the need for accountability, remain deeply ingrained in the national consciousness. Today, as Uganda continues to face challenges such as corruption, political oppression, and poverty, the nation must reckon with its past while moving forward. Amin's regime serves as a painful reminder of what can happen when leaders prioritize their own power over the well-being of the people, and it highlights the necessity of strong democratic institutions, respect for human rights, and a commitment to justice in order to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. In many ways, Uganda's future is still being shaped by the legacy of Idi Amin as the nation works to overcome the lasting effects of his rule while striving to create a more just and prosperous society for future generations. The recovery from such a traumatic period will never be complete, but the resilience of the Ugandan people, surviving, rebuilding, and ultimately thriving, offers a glimmer of hope for the country's continued growth and healing. As Uganda continues to recover from the scars of Idi Amin's brutal dictatorship, the road to healing remains complex and ongoing. The country's efforts to create a stable, peaceful, and prosperous society have been bolstered by a strong desire to overcome the past and build a better future. However, the shadow of Amin's regime is still a significant factor in Uganda's political, social, and cultural landscape. One of the most pressing challenges Uganda faces in the post-Amin era is the question of justice and accountability. Although Amin's regime was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands and the displacement of many more, justice for the victims has been slow to materialize. While there have been efforts to document the atrocities, such as through testimonies of survivors and reports from human rights organizations, the pursuit of justice has been complicated by political and social barriers. Many of Amin's former allies, including those who served in his government or military, remain in positions of power in Uganda, making it difficult to fully confront the past. The issue of reconciliation is another challenge Uganda must navigate. The division between ethnic and religious groups, exacerbated by Amin's policies of favoritism and persecution, continues to impact Ugandan society. Many communities remain deeply divided, and the pain of those who suffered under Amin's regime is still felt. The task of healing these divisions is an enormous one, and the country has attempted various mechanisms for reconciliation, including truth commissions and efforts to memorialize the victims. However, the complex nature of Uganda's post-Amin society means that true healing will take time, with each step forward often met with challenges and setbacks. In the political realm, the legacy of Amin's dictatorship continues to shape the way many Ugandans view leadership and governance. Amin's authoritarian rule left a lasting fear of dictatorship, and even though Museveni's government has brought stability, his long tenure in power has sparked criticism for becoming increasingly autocratic. The political culture of fear and repression that flourished under Amin was not easily erased, and many Ugandans remain wary of the concentration of power in one person's hands. As Museveni has altered the constitution to extend his rule, there is growing concern that Uganda could be headed down the same path of authoritarianism that Amin once trod. Uganda's economy, though growing in recent decades, continues to face significant hurdles. Amin's regime devastated the country's infrastructure, industry, and agricultural sectors, leaving Uganda with a weak foundation. Although much progress has been made in rebuilding the economy, poverty remains widespread, and the country faces high unemployment, inflation, and an over-reliance on foreign aid. Economic inequality, along with corruption in both the public and private sectors, hampers the country's growth and limits opportunities for many Ugandans. Despite these challenges, Uganda's people have shown incredible resilience. The country has made significant strides in education, infrastructure development, and healthcare, and its role in regional stability has improved. The survival of Uganda's diverse cultural and religious communities, despite the attempts by Amin's regime to divide them, is a testament to the strength of the nation's spirit. For the younger generations of Ugandans, those who were born after Amin's regime, there is a growing desire to move beyond the history of violence and oppression. They are increasingly looking to the future, focusing on education, technology, and entrepreneurship as ways to contribute to the nation's growth. However, for those who lived through the horrors of Amin's rule, the pain of the past remains a haunting reminder of the need for a better political and social system that values democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. In conclusion, while Uganda's journey toward recovery from the horrors of Idi Amin's regime has been a long and difficult one, the country continues to make progress. The task of reconciling the painful history of the past with the aspirations for a brighter future is far from complete, but Uganda's determination to rebuild itself and learn from its history is a source of hope. The lessons of Amin's rule about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of inclusivity, and the need for justice and accountability are ever present, guiding Uganda as it strives to build a stronger, more democratic society for future generations.